You know, I'm so proud. My wife is here tonight. She's sitting right down here, and she never believes anybody comes to these things. So I know the gas situation, and I really appreciate you coming. I must say, looking out on a crowd like this on a night when it's pretty hard to get gas, it reminds me of some years back I was invited to speak at a small college in Louisiana, deep in the bayou country. It's Louisiana College is the name of it. And it was a beautiful spring day. And it was in this auditorium. Every seat was filled. Kids were sitting in the aisles. I looked up in the balcony. Every seat was filled there. There was no air conditioning in the building. And kids, they had raised the windows that went down one side of the auditorium, these big old-fashioned kind of windows that we remember from when we all were in school, and kids were sitting on the windowsills, and in the window right next to the speaker's podium there was a tree, and I looked out there, and three boys had climbed up in the tree and were sitting on a branch and looking into the auditorium, and I was just really struck. I mean, it sort of choked me up, and I said, you know, I can't tell you how much I appreciate young people who had come out on a beautiful day like this to hear me speak. And the kid on the front row said, "It's mandatory." So I know that nobody made you come tonight, and I want to thank you for coming. And I'm really honored that you would come out on a night like this. You know, I covered President Carter when I was a reporter covering the White House. I came to know Hamilton Jordan very well. And Hamilton's wife, Dorothy, and his sister are both here tonight, and I'd just like for them to, wherever they are, just stand up, and there they are. You know, I'm a cancer survivor. I had bladder cancer. I've got all kinds of diseases. My doctor says for the shape I'm in pretty good shape. But when I came down with this disease, bladder cancer, Hamilton called me. Somehow or another, when you have cancer, other people who have it seem to know about it. And Hamilton always knew when somebody had cancer. And he called me and he said, "What can I do to help you?" He said, "Let me just talk to you a little bit." He said, "Take charge of your disease. No one is going to be more interested in the cure than you are. Don't be afraid to question the doctors. Always get a second opinion." And he said, "Understand that when you come through this, one thing that will help you a lot is to talk to other people about it." And I was very private about things like that. I never really had liked to talk about medical things, but he said, you know, you'll have a tremendous opportunity to help other people. And he said, in fact, that will help you feel better. Well, the truth of the matter is all of that was true. After I had this and I started taking the treatments and they removed the tumor, my doctor told me that had I waited 2 more weeks to go to the doctor, it would have gotten outside the bladder, and it would have been a whole different story. For once in my life, when I thought something was wrong, I went to the doctor. And so I went on Don Imus's radio program and told about this, and then I was on CNN with Wolf Blitzer and began to talk about it. And I was overwhelmed with telephone calls, emails, people who said, you know, I didn't know what the symptoms were. I didn't know. I kind of felt like maybe I was the only one that ever had this. And in an amazing kind of way, I felt of those people that perhaps I may have at least helped save someone's life. And beyond that, it made me understand that we cannot ever be ashamed of disease, and especially cancer. My wife, Pat, stand up and just say hello to everybody. My wife is a survivor of breast cancer. My mother died of breast cancer because she was afraid to go to the doctor. She had had friends who had had these horrible experiences with chemotherapy and then died, and she just simply did not want to go through it. On the other hand, my wife, Pat, and I remember saying to her when she went to the hospital to have the surgery, and it's still kind of hard for me to talk about it, but I said, are you afraid? And she said, no, I want to see my daughters grow up. Those kids are older now than she likes to admit. And we have 3 granddaughters. But a contrast to that, she went to the doctor. My mother died because she was afraid to go to the doctor, especially these diseases like bladder cancer, which are kind of what I call below-the-belt diseases. We always are embarrassed to talk about them. We can't be embarrassed about cancer. We also have to remember that being told now that you have cancer is not the death penalty that it once was. Every day, in every way, they're finding out more about this disease, and the chances for surviving are much better than they ever were. So I didn't come here to make my cancer speech tonight. I came here to talk about my book. But I just feel, Dorothy, with you here, that I just wanted to say something about what a wonderful thing Hamilton did and how many lives he changed. Hamilton Jordan changed my life, and he gave me a new outlook on life. I will never, ever forget that. Thank you. Let me just talk to you a little bit about the book, and then I'll take some questions. And I think what I will do is take for my text, if I may, tonight, something that Helen Thomas, the great reporter, once said back when we were covering President Ford. Helen was the first reporter that I met when I came to Washington, and how we came to meet. This was 1969. Nixon had just come into office, and I was the rookie reporter in the Washington Bureau. So it was my duty every Sunday to go over to the White House and cover the church services that Richard Nixon held in the East Room of the White House every Sunday. Now, you know, we all seem to have forgotten about that, and I don't know why people didn't make more of it. I mean, with all this business we go through now about the separation of church and state and all that, but nobody seemed to take any offense to it, maybe because these had become such social occasions. They didn't really seem like church services. They would have a visiting minister come in, and he'd have a little sermon, and then everybody'd sing some hymns, and at the end, everybody would go up there to be a receiving line and shake hands with the president. And White House staffers started using these invitations to come to these church services in the East Room to pay back social obligations. I mean, you know, if they were invited to somebody's house for dinner, they'd invite them to come to the White House for church services. And so my job was to go over there and make sure there was no news. If there had ever been any news, they would have had Dan Rather come in and do it. He was the White House correspondent. But there never was any news, and I was just there to make sure that there wasn't. And one Sunday, the security in those days was not nearly as strict as it is today. And for some reason, the Secret Service must have been looking the other way when this receiving line formed to go up and shake hands with the president. And Helen said, "Get in line. We'll go up there and ask the president some questions." I said, "Well, Helen, we're not supposed to get in the line." "No, get in the line. Nobody's looking. We'll ask him a question." I said, "Well, I don't have any questions." "No, we'll think of something," she said. And she said, we'll ask him about these advisors. Well, there was a story going around that Nixon was going to bring in some new advisors, and nobody knew from where. So when he got up there, she said, "Ask him the question." So I shook hands with the president. I said, "Hello, Mr. President." And he said, "Hello." And I said, "Mr. President, these advisors you're going to bring in, are these in-house advisors?" "Well, no, he said, "these will be out-house advisors." And then "Well, no," he said, "you know what I mean." And he wandered off. Because of that, I can say that I've interviewed every president since Nixon. I'm not sure how many other people would call that an interview, but I call it one. And I told my mother, and she thought it was a great question. So in our family, Richard Nixon is the first president that I've interviewed, and I interviewed everyone since. But what I was going to sort of take as my text tonight, you know how the minister always picks out a piece of scripture and then builds a sermon around it. Well, my text tonight is something Helen later said when we're all covering the White House during President Ford's White House days. And one day they brought in Henry Kissinger to give us a background briefing. And the press secretary said, now, Dr. Kissinger is very, very busy. He only has 20 minutes, not a minute more, so don't try to prolong this. 20 minutes is the limit. And Kissinger, among other things, was quite a ham, said, well, you know, being a former professor, I'm not sure I can time my lecture to 20 minutes. I'm used to doing 40 minutes. Helen was on the front row, and she said, well, just start at the end. She really did. So I think I will start at the end tonight, and I will talk a little bit about politics and how this campaign is breaking down and where I think it's going in these debates that are coming up, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll take some questions. I would just say at the beginning that I was going to retire last year, and my bosses said, don't you want to hang around for one more campaign? And boy, I want to tell you, that's the best advice that I have ever received. I wouldn't have missed this for the world. I mean, you cannot make up the kind of campaign that we're seeing unfolding here. I mean, think about it. If you were going to write a play and you were going to cast, you know, two nominees and their running mates, I mean, we use this word historic so much that it's almost become a cliche, but it truly is historic. You know, the first African-American to get a major party nomination after beating the first woman who was really taken seriously as a presidential candidate. And I want to tell you, I really sincerely believe that Hillary Clinton has advanced the cause of women in the kind of race that she ran. The next woman who runs for president will be taken seriously at the beginning and will be standing on Hillary Clinton's shoulders. She ran a great race. It was a great campaign. And then on the other side, a true American hero, this man who, you know, was injured as a prisoner of war. We've never had a prisoner of war run for president before. Injured so badly that he can't raise his arms above his shoulders and comb his own hair. And then, out of the blue, he picks this woman with a very compelling life story, Sarah Palin. I mean, John McCain wanted a game changer, and believe me, he got one. I think the interesting thing to me about it is he certainly galvanized the right side of the Republican Party. There's no question that social conservatives and evangelicals who have never liked John McCain very much, I mean, really didn't like him very much, suddenly he is their darling because he's put her on the ticket. Now, whether her appeal is going to extend beyond that, we don't yet know. She is a complete unknown, and she has become almost an issue unto itself because, you've now got the Republicans saying the press is being unfair in their questioning of her. I don't think so. I believe this is, I think she's one 72-year-old heartbeat away from the presidency, and I think people deserve to know as much as we can about everybody who might become president. So I think the questioning is going to continue. I think she's going to have to get out and start talking to reporters more. She's doing some interviews, but I think she's going to have to do even more. And I must say, I have never seen the kind of attention and the kind of curiosity we're seeing about a vice presidential debate as we're seeing with the one that's going to come up on Thursday night. I mean, Gwen Eiffel, who's a good friend of mine and a very good reporter, I think it turned out she got the best assignment out of the bunch. I mean, I think Jim Lehrer or Tom Brokaw and I would have traded places to get a chance to moderate this debate. It's going to be very, very interesting. I think, she's going to have to demonstrate that she's familiar with these issues that she might have to deal with should she become president. I think it's going to be, and I don't care what anybody says, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Joe Biden. He says he'd handle it just like any debate, and I do think that he's really got to stick to the issues on this. I think if he appears condescending, if he becomes sort of a blabbermouth, I think that will play badly. I think Joe Biden has got a tough assignment. I think he has, in his own way, as tough an assignment on Thursday night as she has. But this debate is really going to be interesting. Both of these people, McCain and Obama keep going back and forth in the polls, but clearly neither one of them has broken away from the other in any real way. I think it may well be the debates that are the tipping point in this election. John McCain wanted a game changer. This was John McCain, the fighter pilot, the guy. You know, there are two kind of people in the Navy. There's that guy that drives the aircraft carrier, and he has all these people around him, a big team to help him do it. And then there's that guy that gets in the fighter plane that flies off the aircraft carrier. He's the lone wolf. He's the guy that puts it all on the line every time he gets in that airplane. And I think that's what we saw here. John McCain, the fighter pilot, going for a game changer, and he got one. But I think the game changer that we got from Wall Street last week trumped that. And I think this campaign is now back to being a lot more about the issues and what's going to happen to the financial underpinnings of this economy than it will be about Sarah Palin. I thought what happened today in Congress, I thought it was stunning. I think that there is no question this is very, very serious. When you see a conservative, Republican, free market president like George Bush agreeing with Nancy Pelosi that this is one of the most serious things to confront the country since the Great Depression, and when you see Barack Obama and John McCain also agreeing on that, I think you have to say that this is very serious business. I think what happened in Washington today, I think Congress is going to have to do something. Whether this was the right thing to do or not, I really am unsure. I was saying back there just a while ago, talking just to friends, I've as a reporter, and I've been a reporter for 51 years now, which seems kind of unbelievable to me, but I have. But in that time, I mean, I've covered everything from hubcap thieves to arms control negotiations to war and peace. But I've never been more unsure about an action that the government was advocating than I was about this action that the administration proposed. It seems to me that it makes sense. I know it is serious, but I just simply don't have the technical expertise, and I'm not sure that many of us do. Maybe there are some that do. The technical expertise to know if this is the right thing to do. But something, as we saw the reaction on Wall Street this afternoon and on the stock market, something is going to have to be done to restore confidence in this system. But to me, watching Washington go at this was sort of like watching the failure of government to confront a major problem after Katrina. But I'm afraid that this could be worse in the long run than by a lot than Katrina. Somehow there's got to be, people keep talking about, does this help Obama, does this help McCain? I'm not sure it helps either one, quite frankly, but what I think is this is something that goes beyond politics and beyond a political campaign, and it's something that one way or the other they're going to have to get together in Washington and take some action. What that's going to be, we'll see down the line, but I think they're going to have to do something, and they're going to have to do it pretty quick. Let me talk to you just a little bit about my book. This is 170 and a half commentaries that I say at the end of Face the Nation every Sunday. I say one of them is just half a commentary. It was an ode to grilled cheese sandwiches, and I don't think that's a full commentary. So it's nearly 171 commentaries. And people said, how did you start to do these commentaries, and why did you pick out the ones that you did? I started really by accident. On the weekend after Richard Nixon died, I just thought the program needed a little button, and so I wrote a little essay about how we can learn from the imperfect as well as the perfect. And then I ended with the lines, Richard Nixon left the White House in disgrace, but he left this life with some dignity. And to my absolute surprise, I was overwhelmed with mail in the next week. This was before email, and people started writing in. So a couple of weeks later, I tried it again, and again, I got a very nice response. So we made it a part of the program. And I've been doing it about 2 months. Nobody in New York, my bosses, said a word about it. And I began to wonder if I really had permission to do this, because we have real strict rules at CBS about expressing your opinion in news stories. And so I thought, well, you know, if I'm not supposed to be doing this, they'll call and tell me to stop, so I'll just keep doing it. And then a couple of months after that, I won a national award from Sigma Delta Chi for commentary. The phones lit up. All the bosses in New York said, congratulations, I was telling so-and-so this is the best thing that CBS has ever had. Some of you may also work at organizations like this. But anyway, after I won that prize, everybody thought it was a great idea. So I just kept right on doing it. It turned out there were 700 of them that I'd written since then. And I just really picked out the ones that I thought, number one, were still relevant, and number two, that were just my favorites. And some of them are very serious, you know, about war and peace and Iraq and so on. But some of them are of a more lighthearted nature. On some of my favorites are the ones that I wrote on holidays. For example, one Father's Day, I wrote an essay in which I noted, and maybe you didn't know this, but more telephone calls are made on Mother's Day than any other day of the year. But more collect calls are made on Father's Day, which helps to underline for all us dads what part of our job is, and that is to pick up the check. So that was one of my personal favorites. I wrote a very long foreword in the book, and then at the end of the book, I wrote a long afterword about the things that I thought that I have learned in 51 years as a reporter. I often call these essays on Face the Nation final thoughts. That's not entirely accurate. I'm not sure any thoughts are final, especially mine. But over those 51 years, I have come to a couple of conclusions, and I outlined those in the book. And basically, here are the things that I think that I have learned, and that is, number one, I believe that democracy cannot be imposed from without. It must come from within. I think we can help other nations to become democratic, but I don't think we can impose democracy on them. It must come from within. And I think if we didn't quite learn that in Vietnam, surely we have come to understand that in Iraq. The second thing that I would say that I have come to believe is that America works best when it works with others. It seems to me when we have our hardest times is when we try to go it alone in the world. I thought one of the saddest things that I heard during the early days of Iraq, when people would say, we don't need other nations to help us. In fact, some in the Pentagon argued, and some within the White House argued, that asking others to help us as we went into Iraq would really just slow the American military down, because it was the best military in the world, and it is. There's no question about that. But when we tell others we don't need their help, one thing we know for sure, we'll not get it. But when things go wrong, we can be absolutely sure that we will be criticized in a very blistering way. I think America always works best when it works with allies and with those who share our values. I think the third thing that I have learned is that America's true security rests not in its weapons, but in its value system and our way of life. Hubert Humphrey once said that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was the single most effective foreign policy initiative of the last half of the 20th century. The Civil Rights Act had nothing to do with foreign policy, but it told the world who we were, how we felt about each other. It told the world that we were really willing to correct wrongs and do it publicly that had been in place for more than 200 years. And it also told the world that it works, that America maintains the lifestyle that it has by practicing our values. We built, during the Cold War, the greatest arsenal of weapons that the world has ever known. Yet it was not those weapons that won the Cold War. They kept the Soviet Union at bay. What won that war is when the people on the other side of the Iron Curtain looked across and saw the people on the other side, and there are no secrets on the other side of the tracks in the television age. When those people looked across the Iron Curtain and saw a better way of life over there, they wanted some of it. They didn't want rockets and rifles and guns. They wanted television sets and washing machines and good schools where their children could go, and a government where they could have a say in what was happening. And when they realized that the government they had was not able to furnish those things, that's when the Iron Curtain began to crumble. That's when the Berlin Wall came down. I think one of the greatest things that has happened in the last half of the 20th century was when the Berlin Wall came down. Those kids sang the anthem of our own civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome." And the music that was played as they sang "We Shall Overcome" came from American-made boom boxes. When other countries take the symbols and the songs that symbolize our freedom, when they do that, that tells you that we are very secure. When other people want the kind of life that we have, that is the best kind of security that we can have. The other thing I have learned that goes along with this is that we must practice what we preach. We can't talk about the virtues and the values of a free press if we get caught trying to bribe newsmen. We don't need torture as part of our foreign policy. We don't need secret prisons as part of our national policy. Our message to the world has to be, that's what the other guys do. If we can do that, that is a story we need to tell the world. And not only tell the world, but that's the story we must tell our children. My favorite historian, Will Durant, once said that while Rome was not built in a day, neither did it fall in a week. It took 300 years for the Roman Empire to fall, which is longer than any democracy has existed in the history of the world. That is what we want our children to know, that democracy must be nurtured, it must be defended, and it must be loved by each and all of us if it is to succeed. We must never, ever, as wondrous as it is, ever take America for granted. Let me just close with something I said on television Sunday. Last Friday, I went to Ole Miss to cover the presidential debates there. The last time I had been on that campus had been in 1962. I had just gotten out of the Air Force. I was a young reporter from Texas, and I was sent down there to cover the enrollment of someone we later came to know was named James Meredith. I got there, and shortly after arriving, riots broke out on that campus. 166 people were hurt that night. 2 people were killed. 44 of the injured were federal marshals. People set fires on the campus. I had spent 3 years in the United States Air Force and never heard a shot fired in anger. And yet I was almost killed that night. A sniper climbed to the roof of one of the dormitories and began firing into the crowds of rioters and reporters and the rest of us federal marshals who were all on that campus that night. All of this took place because these people, led by the governor of the state, were trying to prevent a black man from attending a state tax-supported university. It took the 82nd Airborne that came onto the campus the next morning to finally restore order. James Meredith lived under armed guard for the entire time that he was at the University of Mississippi, but he went on to graduate. And that was a significant milestone in the civil rights movement that was going on all across the South that summer. I went back there Friday, walked in the same place where that riot took place, saw black kids and white kids working together to make sure everything was just perfect for that debate, which featured the first African American to get the nomination of a major American political party. It was more than just a debate that we saw that night. It was a magnificent moment in the history of America. And I want to tell you, I was very proud to be a part of it. Thank you very much. So now
we have microphones over here and over here for your questions. We're going to take questions for the next half hour or so, and it is a unique opportunity for you to get a chance to talk to Bob Schieffer and ask him questions about things that are going on. And in fact, I'm going to start with, because you have seen the news media over the last 50 years, is it better than it was then, or worse? How would you judge the news media?
Well, what it is, it's different. I think it is better, but we're operating in a totally different environment. And what has changed everything is not cable television. That's changed it to some extent. Not just a 24-hour news cycle, but what has really changed things and brought us into a different world is the Internet. Stop and think about it. This is the first conveyor of news on a national and international scale that has no editor. The worst newspaper has somebody on the staff, an editor, who knows where the stuff comes from. The Internet, things pop up on it. You don't know if it's true. You don't know if it's false. You don't know where it came from. There's some very good websites. I think CBS has a good website. There are others like the Huffington Post that present many different sides to issues and are an outlet for people to express a serious opinion. But there are others that are no more than someone gets up in the middle of the night, has a thought, and posts it on its website. And, you know, they're about the same level of someone standing on the corner holding a sign that says the end is near. Now, it may be, but you would kind of like to know what evidence that person saw that caused him to come to that conclusion. And that's the level that a lot of these websites operate at right now. They may be good for someone's mental health, but I'm not sure you could call that journalism in any way. And let me just tell you how, one example of how all this works. After Senator McCain put Sarah Palin on the ticket, all of these rumors or reports began to circulate on the Internet. I mean, they were just totally scurrilous. As to the best of my knowledge, they have proven to be false. The mainstream media didn't touch any of that stuff. We did ask questions about it, like you do anything when you get a news tip. That's how you get news. You go and you hear something, you check it out to see if it's true. We didn't write or broadcast anything about that until the McCain campaign put out a written statement that said Sarah Palin's 17-year-old daughter was pregnant and that she was making this public to put down some of these scurrilous rumors. We got a lot of criticism for broadcasting and circulating this stuff. This is something we had nothing to do with. The networks, the big newspapers, anybody in a credible news organization. And yet, to a lot of people who don't see the difference or really don't spend the time thinking through all of this, it probably hurts our credibility and so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with it and doing the best we can. The candidates, people in politics are dealing with it, but it has changed things and made it very, very different. And that's the biggest difference I see in the media right now. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Words he would always say, "Don't tell us your Mrs. Oswald story." He would threaten you, "Don't tell us the Mrs. Oswald story." So I wondered, could you tell it to us here tonight? I know it, but it's so
Well,
good.
I tell you, I almost was the only one. Tom Brokaw once, I was
really?
going to be on, when my friend Tim Russert had that cable show, and Brokaw heard that I was going to be on, and he called Russert and said, "If you let Schieffer tell that Oswald story, I'm going to shoot the television set." But in the event that there is some person in this audience who hasn't told this story, I will, since it's been asked, I will tell it. When I was a young reporter at the Star-Telegram on that awful weekend when President Kennedy came to Dallas, I was the night police reporter, and so I was asleep when the president was shot in Dallas. And I had gotten up and gotten dressed and tried to get down and just help out. So I was on the city desk answering phones. It was complete bedlam. And a woman called, and I picked up the phone, and she said, "Is there anybody there who can give me a ride to Dallas?" And I said, "Well, lady, we don't run a taxi service here." emphasized, the president's been shot. And she said, yes, I heard it on the radio. I think my son is the one they've arrested. And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. Why she called the Star-Telegram, I have no idea. But I quickly forgot about that part about running a taxi service, asked her where she lived, and another reporter and I went out to get her. The reason I took another reporter is I had a TR-4 sports car in those days, and the top was down, and it took about 20 minutes to get the top up and on, because I didn't think I could drive this woman to Dallas in a two-seater sports car. You know, it's about an hour ride over there. So I went to the auto editor of the paper. His name was Bill Foster, and the local car dealers would give him a car every week to drive, and he'd drive it, and then he'd write a little review of it in the Sunday paper, and these were generally very good reviews. A free car, free gas. You can see how this worked. And so anyway, it turned out he had a Cadillac. Well, I went and got him, and the two of us went out there to the address she had given. She's standing on the curb with a little blue travel bag on her white practical nurse's uniform. So I got her in the back seat with her, and Bill drove, and we drove her over to Dallas. And I interviewed her along the way. Nobody else talked to her for about 3 weeks. But once we got there, in those days, to show you another thing that's a little different about journalism, we never told people who we were. If they asked, we told them. But if they thought we were detectives, we just let them think that. So I always wore a snap brim hat, so I'd look like Dick Tracy. And when I got there, I went up to the first uniformed policeman, and I said, I'm the one that brought Oswald's mother over here. I said, is there anywhere we can put her where these reporters won't be bothering her? And so they found a little office in the burglary squad, and it was back there, and it was great because there was a phone back there. And I could go out in the hall where all the other reporters were and gather up information and then go back and phone it in on this phone. And, kids today don't understand what I'm talking about, but in those days, if you didn't have a phone, you didn't have a story. Now, of course, everybody has a cell phone, and they just don't get it. They don't know what I'm talking about, but this was a great advantage. Well, we'd been there about 4 hours, I guess. Dark. It was getting dark, coming on dark, and she said, do you think they'd let me talk to him? And I said, well, I don't know. I'll go ask. So I went to Captain Will Fritz, who was the chief of homicide, and I said, his mother would like to talk to him. Is that possible? And he said, well, we probably ought to do that. So we were all taken to this little holding room off the jail, and I'm sitting there thinking, my heavens, I'm going to get to hear this man that's been charged with assassinating the president. And, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know if this was the first shot of World War III. We didn't know. They'd closed the border with Mexico. And so I thought maybe I'll even get the chance to interview him. And then finally a guy standing over in the corner said, who are you? And I said, well, who are you? And he said, are you a reporter? And I said, well, yes. And he said, listen, I want to tell you something. He said, you get out of here, because he said, if I ever see you again, I'm going to kill you. And I guess he was overstating it, but he was pretty mad. So he might have meant it. I excused myself, of course, and that's the end of the story. But, what an adventure that was. And it's why when people ask me, why are you a reporter? I mean, it's because you have a chance to become involved in that kind of an adventure. I sometimes think back on it, and I'm not sure I believe it, but it actually happened. It is true. I have the story that I wrote in the Star-Telegram about it the next morning, but what a deal. And it just shows you, how much things have changed. I mean, you couldn't get in a police station now, if you didn't have the proper identification. In those days, if you look like you belong someplace, most of the time you could get in. Yes, sir.
Often when we're watching you on Face the Nation, you have a guest on who says something that you find very difficult to believe. At least that's what your eyes say. And you start out by saying something like, now let me understand what you're... Did it take much practice to get to that point?
It's sometimes you want to just reach across the table and slap them. But, I mean, that probably wouldn't be a good thing. What I try to do is I try to ask the same question about 3 times in 3 different ways. And if I can't get them to answer, I take it that their non-answer is going to be seen as an answer, and people will understand that they're just trying to avoid the question. But I try to give them a chance. But, it's so interesting that we've all become so sophisticated in managing information now. People, when I came to Washington, most congressmen didn't have press secretaries. Now, the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Hides and Skins has a press secretary and a media coach and is taught to stay on message and all that. I think it's the wrong way to go. I think they really hurt themselves when they don't answer the questions. I mean, if I were a PR person, which I'm not, what I would tell them is, if you have something to say, then go on television. If you don't have something to say, don't waste everybody's time and go on television, because you wind up looking bad. But so far, my advice hasn't been taken by very many people. I tell you, the one person, and he's a friend of mine and has been for many years, but was always my favorite guest, was Sam Knott. I mean, I would sometimes call Sam and ask him to be on Face the Nation, and he would say, I really don't have anything to say this week. And I'd say, okay, Sam, thank you very much. And I just wish that there were more people that followed the tactic that Sam did. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I hope you never retire. But secondly, I have two questions, and you can answer one or both. Who's the most interesting political figure that you ever covered? And what is your first question going to be at the debate that you moderate?
Well, I think the first question is going to have to be something about the economy, but we'll wait and see where everything is by the time we get there. The second question, the most interesting politician, and this goes back a long, long way. The one that I will never, ever forget was the first politician I ever saw, and it was Lyndon Johnson. I was 11 years old. He was running for the United States Senate, and he came to the vacant lot where we played baseball, and my dad took me down to see him. And the reason we all went down there is we heard he was coming in a helicopter, and we had never seen a helicopter. So this was a big event in the neighborhood, and we're all down there standing on this vacant lot, and all of a sudden, up in the sky, here's this airplane with no wings, and then on this bullhorn, "This is your candidate for the United States Senate, Lyndon Johnson." We knew at that moment how Moses felt when he realized that burning bush was talking directly to him. I mean, we didn't know if it was Lyndon Johnson. We didn't know if it was God. We didn't know what it was. We were absolutely terrified. And then this thing landed. Johnson gets out, makes this wonderful speech, never took his hat off, and at the end of the speech took that hat and threw it out into the crowd, waved goodbye, got on that helicopter and flew away. And many years after that, I told Jake Pickle, a longtime congressman from Austin, about this. And he said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "That was my job in the campaign." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I was the hat catcher." And I said, "What?" He said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "Lyndon Johnson was the tightest person on the face of the earth. He was not going to waste a hat on a political rally." And he said, "I was a student at the University of Texas in those days." And he said, "What I would do," he said, "I would drive to wherever the rally was. I would go up to the front row, and when Johnson saw me, he'd take that hat off and throw it to me." And he said that I'd take the hat, run around behind the helicopter, he'd put it on, and they'd fly off to the next stop. So, I mean, how could you not? How could that not leave an impression on an 11-year-old kid? From that moment on, I became interested in politics. I can remember reading the paper every day until the election to see where Lyndon Johnson was and where that helicopter was. And I guess that was the day I really kind of fell in love with politics. Thank you very much for the question. It's one of my favorite memories. Yes, sir. Oh, over here. Yes, ma'am.
Bob, first, we feel very fortunate to have you as a Texas Christian University graduate.
Thank you.
As I am. And one of the questions, the one question I wanted to ask you, your impression of Tim Russett and his death.
Well, Tim and I were very close friends, and people say, "How could you be good friends because you were such fierce competitors?" And we were. I mean, when I put one by on old Russert, I felt like I'd hit a home run off the best pitcher in the league. I mean, he was tough competition, and he made me much better at what I do because I could never let down because I always knew he was over at that other place, and he was going to be working as hard as he could. But, it's funny. It is like sports. You develop respect for your competitors if they're really, really good. And one time he made me a great compliment. Somebody asked him one time, what do you watch when Meet the Press is preempted by, the tennis tournament or something? He said, "Well, I always watch Face the Nation." And I took that as a great compliment, and the truth of the matter was, it was the same with me. We both loved politics. We both loved those jobs. Tim once said that he thought the Sunday morning programs were national treasures, and that we had sort of been put in charge of that we were kind of the curators, and we both took that very seriously. Meet the Press is the oldest program on television, and Face the Nation is the second oldest. We're 54 years old, and I believe Meet the Press was 60 years old. And I think the interesting thing is, here are the two programs that have lasted the longest on television, and they're most like the way they were in the beginning. There's nothing fancy on these programs. We simply turn on the lights, get the key players of the big story of the week in there, sit them at a table, and ask them questions. And there seems to be an audience for that. Maybe that's a lesson for other programmers in television. Maybe if you kind of go back to doing the basics, maybe you can get people to watch. At least I think so, and I hope so. Tim and I, we had seats. We were next to each other at the Washington National Baseball Park. We both love baseball, and we spent many, many hours together at the ballpark, mostly talking about politics more than watching baseball some of the time. But he was a great person. He was a great father, and he was a great husband. And there's not I think about him all the time, and especially on Sundays. It just doesn't seem right. Tom Brokaw is an even older friend of mine than Tim was, but to look over and see NBC on that other monitor and know Tim is not there, it'll be a long time before they find somebody that will replace him. I'm not sure he can be, there'll never be another Tim Russert, but he taught us all a lot, and I just loved him to death. He's just a great guy. So thank you for asking me that. Yes?
Thank you so much for being here.
Uh-huh.
In 2000, 2004, Ralph Nader was left out of the presidential debates. In 2000, the commission said he was left out because he wouldn't have an impact on the race. After the election, no one really doubted that the consumer advocate had a huge impact on the race. Do you think that people like Ralph Nader, candidates like Cynthia McKinney, Bob Barr, should be allowed in the debates, and that the country would benefit from hearing more voices? Thank you.
Well, I think they did have a chance. They took part in the primaries, and they were out there talking during the primary season, running as independents. But the debate commission has said that they must have a certain percentage. They must be at a certain point in the polls, and I think you have to cut it off somewhere. I don't think, although all of them might have some sort of an impact, I think it's fair to say that none of them is going to be president. And I think the two people who are going to be president, one of which is going to be president, I think the American people need a chance to see them going against each other. So I don't really have a quarrel with the way they have set this up. But it's a good question, and it's certainly a legitimate question. I kind of like it the way it is. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I'm going to tell you your commentary about voting is one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you.
For those of you that haven't read it yet, I read it to my husband this morning at breakfast about voting makes you feel big and strong. I love that.
Now, my mother always said that. And,
yeah,
and
well,
that's
and
really
it
where I
is
got
important.
that.
But I wanted to ask you that I always wonder, is it difficult, because from what I've read, and I'm a real I love politics too, but when you're in Washington and you go out with these politicians, I mean, we read about all the parties and that kind of thing, and you become friends with them. Do you feel that sometimes maybe you pull your punches, and because some of them you have become good friends with, and so maybe you lose your objectivity?
Well, I try not to, and you're right. It's easy. You can fall into that kind of trap. But you know what I always try to remember is that they don't like me because I've got a cute personality. They like me because I work at CBS News, and I have a megaphone that they would love to share, and so I always try, if I can, to keep that in mind. But it is. I mean, you have to be careful. But one thing about it is we are trained professionals. I mean, and it's like being a doctor. You know, a doctor has to put his feelings aside when he's operating on a patient, whether that's an enemy or a friend. And I like to think that after you've done this for a long, long time, you can do that. You know, one of the things, I remember one time David Martin on 9/11, which was an extremely difficult story for all of us to cover, because most of the time we're covering stories about other people. This time it was our families whose lives were at risk. It was our friends. I knew 11 people who either died or had relatives or friends who were killed on 9/11. But I remember David Martin was driving out to the Pentagon. He's our Pentagon correspondent. He saw this big cloud of smoke come up, and it was the plane that hit the Pentagon. He was on the other side of the building, and he thought that an oil tanker or something had turned over on the highway. The Washington Beltway runs close by there. And so he parked his car and got out to walk around the other side of the building. There was all this smoke. And suddenly he saw all these bodies spread out, across the grounds of the Pentagon, and he realized that what it was. But he said, I was kind of ashamed of myself, but said my professionalism kicked in, and I started counting to see how many there were. And that's what you do as a reporter. I mean, you kind of put your emotions aside, and you have to, in social situations, do the same thing. But, by the same token, there are some people you like and some people you don't like. And you have to be as careful to treat the people you don't like fairly as you do the people you like. But I think it's a very good question. But I think it's also good to kind of get out of Washington from time to time. One of the reasons I like to come out and talk to gatherings like this is kind of a focus group for me. I can find out what's on people's minds by the questions they ask. I mean, you all are being especially kind tonight. So I'm going to take this away that everybody really does like me a lot. No, I do. You're all being very, very nice, and thank you very much. But it's a good question, and we have to always be on guard about that. Yes, sir.
I just wondered if you could tell some history about examples in
about what?
Examples in political campaigns of extremely dirty tactics. I grew up in Florida, and I have never forgotten the story of Claude Pepper,
George Smathers,
whose Senate seat was basically taken away on made up charges by George Smathers.
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
Smathers.
I'm also thinking of the Willie.
Smathers said his sister was a known thespian. Remember that?
Yeah. But in other words, trying to imply sexual aspects that were irrelevant and stupid. I think the use of the Willie Horton photo in
I agree with you.
What was that? 88?
Yes.
And I think that right up to the 2000, the rumor spreading about McCain's black child. I mean,
yeah.
Can you just make some
sure.
comments about these things?
Yes, this has always been a part of politics, but I think it's become more prevalent in recent years. I think in the end it hurts the whole process, and it hurts the people who use it. But negative campaigns do work in the short term. But I think in the long haul, they not only hurt the candidate, they hurt the whole system, and they hurt and damage the person's ability to govern. I mean, I had, he wasn't a friend, he was an acquaintance who was a political consultant who always said at the beginning of every campaign cycle he reread Machiavelli, that, the ends justify the means. I think that I kind of more agree with Gandhi, who said the ends reflect the means. And I think we're seeing just the whole credibility of politicians in general driven down by these very negative campaigns. Let me tell you, just as an example of that, when I was a little boy, my grandmother thought that I would grow up to be president of the United States. Well, obviously I didn't. But that's what all grandmothers thought about their grandsons in those days. And I would just ask you this question. How long has it been since you've run into anyone who said they hope their grandchild grew up to be a politician, parent or grandparent? And I think that is an example of what these campaigns and the kind of tactics you're talking about, what they've done to our political system. What we do now, I mean, we're en route to having our first $2 billion presidential campaign. We spend more money and we take longer to select our candidates, but too many good people don't want to fool with the process. And I would also pose another question. Does anybody believe that we're getting a better level of candidates in either party than we did it a different way, than when we did it a different way and when it didn't cost us nearly so much? I'll be glad if anybody thinks that we are. I'll be glad to hear your argument, but you'll have a hard time convincing me. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I grew up in Texas, too, in San Antonio, of Mexican descent. And when I was growing up, I don't think anybody thought about immigration. And as it's turned out, I practiced business immigration law. And when I'm around people in a social setting and they ask me, well, what do you think about immigration? I've learned to say, well, what do you think? Because it's a very polarizing issue now, but it's really made America a different place. And I'd love to hear what you think about the role of immigration in America now.
What I think is that that's one of the questions I'm going to ask in the third presidential debate. I'm going to try to get the candidates to give us a realistic answer on immigration. I think we have yet to come up with a realistic policy. I mean, I know people say you can build a fence down there. Okay, fine. I Googled this. To build a fence along this border would be to build a fence of the same distance from Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to the Sears Tower in Chicago. Now, that's going to be a pretty good-sized fence. And this can't be, you know, two cowboys in a pickup truck with some cedar posts and barbed wire. This is going to be have to be a much more complicated kind of fence than that. And the other question that I have is, if you're not going to have some sort of path to citizenship to the people who are already here, what are you going to do with them? You know, we had a lot of trouble getting enough buses to get the people out of New Orleans. And you're talking about millions of people that are in this country. How many buses will that take? How many trains would that take? Or if you're going to put them all in prison, how much would you have to spend to build a prison, put them all in? Nobody has yet come up with a realistic answer to this. And it'll be interesting to see what these candidates say when I put that question to them. It's a festering problem. It's a problem that no one has yet come up with a solution to, but it obviously is a problem that is of great concern to many people in this country. Yeah. I'm sorry, over here. Okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, Bob. I too am sorry TCU lost to Oklahoma because I bet on the Horned Frogs. But
good.
But I had a question for you, and you touched upon this in some of your previous books. I think this just in, when you were a young reporter joining CBS and that high-powered news division in the late 60s. And Roger Mudd really elaborated on that in his book, which was a great book, too. And he was kind of talking about it from his perspective because he was one of the established guys there. And he mentioned when guys like you and Barry Serafin would come in and the hazing sort of process. I thought that's, and you touched upon it, too. Could you talk a little bit more what it was like coming into that high-powered news division?
Well, it was, I have said before, it was like a little leaguer, you know, suddenly being called a pinch hit in Yankee Stadium. I mean, you know, when I walked in that bureau, I will never forget that day. I mean, Dan Rather was the White House correspondent. Marvin Kalb was the State Department correspondent. Roger Mudd was the Capitol Hill correspondent. Dan Shore did general assignments. And then kind of up on cloud 99 above all of us was Eric Severide, who did the commentary. It was an unbelievable coming together of some of the best writers and journalists, I think, really in the history of broadcasting. I mean, the team that was assembled in Washington was as good a team as the original team that Ed Murrah put together that became, you know, the foundation of CBS News. And I'm not sure we'll ever see that a group that talented, ever come together again. But it was just my dream to be there, and that's what I'd always wanted to do. And these people were my real heroes, especially Walter Cronkite. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience, and those were some really, really great years. We all had fun. It's like a baseball team. We didn't all necessarily like each other that much, but we all realized, I mean, we did have friends within the group, but, we realized that working together, we were better than any one of us, and we were all proud to be part of it. It was just great. Thank you very much. One more question, or two.
This is sort of a follow-up. You were a
Yeah.
reporter in Texas in the 60s, and I just wonder if you personally think that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone.
Do I think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone? I have a very open mind about it. The one thing I do know for sure is he was a cold-blooded killer. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think there's any question that he did it. I've always had an open mind as to whether someone helped him. At this point, I've never seen any evidence that convinced me that there was somebody else, but I'm still open to it. I can see how that might well be. I'm not sure we'll ever know.
Why did he do it?
Why did he do it?
If he was acting alone.
Well, he was crazy, and irrational people do irrational things, and I don't think you can explain the actions of a mentally ill person. Did somebody hire him to do it? That would be the kind of person you would hire to do something like that. There's no question that Fidel Castro wanted John Kennedy dead because the Kennedys had tried to kill him, and he knew that. But I have not yet seen anything that I would say was solid evidence that there was any link there. I know that he did it, though. I mean, I'm convinced that he did it. There's been kind of a revisionist thing that maybe, he was somehow some sort of victim. There's no question that he called J.D. Tippett, the police officer, when he called Oswald over to his police car as he left the school book depository. Oswald just shot him at point-blank range, and the witnesses and all of that. He was a killer. But I don't know. As far as I know, he acted alone, but I'm still open to more evidence that suggests there was somebody else there. One final question.
Yes, thank you. Can you talk briefly about the procedure that you follow for determining the topic for the week and the guests that you secure for Face the Nation? Is that something that is done by a panel, or do you have a lot of...
We have a very small staff on Face the Nation. There's myself and two producers, and that's it. It's the three of us, and we do the whole thing. One of the reasons that Face the Nation and Meet the Press have been on the air so long is it's just so cheap to produce them. And we are in a profit-making business here. These are not charities. But we have, very, very low overhead. And what we do is we just try to figure out who the key player is in whatever the biggest story of the week is. And there's great competition now because there's 5 Sunday shows, and generally we're all after, the same guests. I mean, we got lucky and got Obama Sunday. The ABC show had John McCain. But, sometimes we get the bear, sometimes he gets us. But mainly it's just aggressive booking and trying to think ahead, figure out who's going to be the person you really want to talk to that week. And then you just go after them. And we have to be, when we ask somebody to be on the show, we're very careful about canceling them. And we do that only on rare occasions because when people make arrangements to be on these shows, they're rearranging schedules. And, getting Obama last week and getting him in the studio in Washington, that was a major deal. Because he's out in the middle of a campaign and everything. And then with this economic thing that came up. But it's no more complicated than that. What's the big story this week? What do we think it's going to be? Who are the people that are going to be involved? And try to get one person on either side, generally, is what you do. And that's how we do it. Well, this has been a wonderful evening. It's always fun to come back here. My wife and I have a vacation house over at Sea Island, so we kind of think on Georgia as our second home. And it's great to be here and see so many old friends. And thank you for a wonderful reception.